You know, one of the things that drove me loopy when I was starting out in photography was f-stop numbers particularly. Why was it that the bigger your f-stop number, the less light you had coming in? Drove me crazy, and I just couldn't get my head around it for so long. And then one day it clicked. The number doesn't represent the amount of light you're letting in. The number represents the amount of light you're stopping coming in. And that's why when you increase the number, you decrease the light. But why was it that nobody just explained it to me like that in the first place? There's so many things that you learn as a beginner that are taught in a roundabout fashion that only later on can you get your head into and around. And today we're going to be delving into something else that is quite a big misconception and could actually drive you loopy. Now, another thing that drove me crazy was focusing. But actually, it wasn't focusing that drove me crazy. It was why my images weren't sharp. It drove me mental. I kept focusing right. I knew I was focusing right. I'd learned how to focus right. And yet I still wasn't getting sharp images. And this is another one of those things where a lot of that came down to the fact that I don't think it's taught very well, or I don't think it's put across very well. A bit like that f-stop thing that I was talking about. It's focus and sharpness are generally spoke about in the same breath. They're generally intertwined and intertangled, and quite often we'll talk about getting sharp images through hitting focus, but actually focus and sharpness are two very different things indeed, and understanding the difference between them kind of helps you to understand how to go about getting sharp images. And for me, finding out about this relieved some of the doolally moments that I was having when I got back home and I looked at my screen and my images were not sharp. Now, I'm here today in the State Woodland in the Peak District National Park. It's beautiful. It's just lovely. It's quite wet today. It's quite damp. There's a little bit of mist in the air. Everything kind of feels a little bit ethereal. And I don't want sharpness throughout the photos that I'm going to take, but I do want focus. I do want to be focused in without having sharpness. So of course, focus and sharpness can't be the same thing, because if they were, as long as you focus, you can have sharpness in your shot. So what is focus? Well, focus is the point from which you want rays of light to converge onto your sensor. So you focus in on something and that will converge the light rays that are reflecting off that thing to converge and hit your sensor at a single spot, and that spot is called the point of maximum sharpness. Now, focus of course does affect sharpness because it determines where the point of maximum sharpness is, and it also determines the start and finish point of acceptable sharpness. But there are several other factors that affect sharpness itself. Now, of course, your camera and lens affect sharpness, and how your light gets through your lens to hit your sensor is a big determining factor, and how your sensor deals with that light once it hits it is a big determining factor. But apart from the technical bit, you've got aperture, understanding depth of field. Depth of field is the biggest thing that I see when people ask why their images aren't sharp and they're shooting at 1.4 because look, I got a brand new lens and everything must go at 1.4. I definitely hit focus. Depth of field, you need to understand it Shutter speed is the next one. Shutter speed away from artistic side as well as aperture. Your shutter speed needs to take into account things like movement within your composition, so like the wind, like we talked about last week's video about weather. It also needs to take into account things like your focal length, and both of these things, aperture and shutter speed, determine how much light gets in through your lens. Not enough light hitting your sensor also loses sharpness. And why is that? It's because it's one of the big determining factors of sharpness. Light plays a massive part in sharpness in your image. If you aren't getting enough light onto your sensor through your lens, then you are not allowing your images to be sharp. And actually, it should be said that counter to that, overexposing, getting too much light onto your sensor will also mean that your images don't turn out completely sharp as well. One of the reasons why I think this is important to explain is because I see questions posed on forums all the time about why an image isn't sharp, and the amount of times that other photographers will go straight to that camera's not capable, or you need a better lens, or even things like telling you to micro adjust if you're using a DSLR. Well, some people recommend it for mirrorless as well, which shows how little they know, because you don't need to micro adjust lenses for mirrorless cameras, but they'll tell you to micro adjust your lens, and half the time you can look at your settings and determine that if you were handheld with a 200mm lens on and you were out at 200mm at f2.8 with 1/15 of a second, that's why you've not got a sharp image. It's got nothing to do with the technical ability of your camera and lens. And another thing to understand as well is, because sharpness is an idea, sharpness is subjective. Sharpness is something that only you can determine. So I think a focus point by itself will not deliver sharpness within your image. You need to consider all of these other factors. But that's not to say that focus itself isn't important. Understanding how to get that maximum detail and that maximum sharpness onto your sensor at exactly the right point can be determined by which kind of focusing system you use. And that is exactly what this video is about. So head on and click that next, because that's going to tell you how to use the focusing system inside of the camera you've got. I've been Dave, and this has been Let's Click Photography here in the Peak District National Park. And I'll see you on the next one, or that one, pretty soon.